In the grand drawing rooms of Regency England, where fortunes could shift with a single whispered scandal, Eleanor Hartwell clutched her mother's silver pendant as the Duke of Ashworth's steward delivered the crushing blow. "Your services are no longer required." But as she turned to leave Ashworth Manor forever, something extraordinary happened. The Duke himself appeared in the doorway, his piercing blue eyes falling upon the delicate pendant at her throat. His face drained of all colour, and he froze as if he'd seen a ghost. What secret did that simple piece of jewellery hold that could render one of England's most powerful men speechless? If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far this story has travelled. The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Ashworth Manor as Eleanor Hartwell carefully arranged the morning correspondence on the mahogany desk. Her slender fingers, though roughened by years of service, moved with practiced grace across the polished surface. At 23, she possessed a quiet beauty that seemed almost out of place in the servants' quarters. Auburn hair that caught the firelight, intelligent green eyes that missed nothing, and a bearing that suggested she had once known better circumstances. Eleanor had served as lady's maid to the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth for 3 years, ever since her father's debts had forced her family into genteel poverty. The position had been a godsend, allowing her to maintain some dignity while supporting her ailing mother in their modest cottage on the estate's edge. She had grown fond of the elderly Duchess, whose sharp wit and kind heart had made even the most tedious tasks bearable. The silver pendant at Eleanor's throat, her mother's most treasured possession, caught the morning light as she worked. It was a simple piece, really, bearing an intricate Celtic knot design that had been passed down through generations of women in her family. Her mother had insisted she wear it always, claiming it would bring her protection, and perhaps, one day, reveal its true purpose. "Eleanor, dear," came the Dowager Duchess's voice from the adjoining chamber, weak but still commanding. "Please bring my morning tea, and do sit with me a moment. I fear I have troubling news." Eleanor's heart clenched as she prepared the tea service. The Duchess had been growing frailer each day, and Eleanor suspected their time together was drawing to a close. She entered the opulent bedchamber, where the elderly woman lay propped against silk pillows, her once regal bearing now diminished by illness. "Your Grace," Eleanor said softly, setting the tea tray beside the bed. "You seem troubled this morning." The Duchess's rheumy eyes filled with tears as she reached for Eleanor's hand. "My dear child, I'm afraid my nephew has made a decision that breaks my heart. He believes the household expenses are too great, and—" She paused, struggling with the words. "He's dismissed half the staff, including you." Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "But, Your Grace, surely there's been some mistake. I've served faithfully, and you've always been pleased with my work." "Oh, my dear, this has nothing to do with your service, which has been exemplary. This is about money, as it always is with men like my nephew. He sees only numbers in ledgers, not the human cost of his decisions." The Duchess squeezed Eleanor's hand. "I've tried to reason with him, but he's determined to modernize the household, bring in younger staff at lower wages." The cruel irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. She had escaped one form of poverty only to be thrust back into another. Without this position, she would have no means to care for her mother or maintain even their humble cottage. The thought of returning to the workhouse, or worse, made her stomach turn. "When must I leave?" Eleanor asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the turmoil within. "Today, I'm afraid. The steward will provide you with a month's wages and a character reference, though I know that's small comfort." The Duchess's voice broke. "If I were younger, stronger, I would fight this decision, but I fear my influence over my nephew has waned considerably since his father's death." Eleanor had heard whispers about the new Duke of Ashworth, a man in his early 30s who had inherited the title unexpectedly when his older brother died in a riding accident. Unlike his predecessor, who had been known for his generosity and fair treatment of tenants and staff, the new duke was rumored to be cold, calculating, and obsessed with restoring the family's finances after years of his brother's extravagant spending. As Eleanor helped the Duchess with her morning routine one final time, she couldn't help but reflect on the bitter irony of her situation. She had been born into a respectable family, educated alongside the daughters of minor gentry, and had once harbored dreams of marriage to a kind gentleman who would value her intelligence and gentle nature. Instead, she found herself dismissed like a common servant, with nowhere to turn and no prospects for the future. The pendant at her throat seemed to grow heavier as she packed her few belongings into a worn carpet bag. Her mother had always insisted it would protect her, but Eleanor wondered what protection it could offer against the harsh realities of a world that cared nothing for a woman without fortune or connections. A sharp knock at her chamber door interrupted her melancholy thoughts. "Miss Hartwell," came the steward's crisp voice, "His Grace requires your immediate presence in the library to settle your accounts." Eleanor's pulse quickened. She had hoped to avoid meeting the Duke entirely, slipping away quietly as befitted her station. But it seemed fate had other plans. She smoothed her simple grey dress, touched the pendant for courage, and followed the steward through the manor's grand corridors, toward an encounter that would change everything. As they approached the library's imposing oak doors, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would prove far more significant than a simple dismissal. Something in the air seemed charged with possibility, as if the very walls of Ashworth Manor were holding their breath in anticipation of what was to come. The library of Ashworth Manor was a testament to centuries of aristocratic learning, its towering shelves lined with leather-bound volumes that reached toward an ornately painted ceiling. Morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the Persian carpet where Eleanor stood, her hands clasped tightly before her. The room smelled of old parchment, beeswax, and the faint trace of tobacco that seemed to cling to masculine spaces. Behind the massive oak desk sat a man who could only be the Duke of Ashworth himself. Eleanor had glimpsed him from afar during his brief visits to check on his aunt, but she had never been in his direct presence. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 32, with the kind of aristocratic bearing that spoke of generations of privilege. His dark hair was perfectly groomed, his jaw strong and clean-shaven, and his blue eyes held an intensity that made Eleanor feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. "Miss Hartwell," he said without looking up from the papers before him, his voice carrying the crisp accent of the upper classes. "I trust my steward has explained the situation regarding your employment." "Yes, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, proud that her voice remained steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I understand that my services are no longer required." The Duke finally raised his eyes to meet hers, and Eleanor felt a strange jolt of recognition, though she was certain they had never been properly introduced. There was something in his gaze, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even surprise, that made her unconsciously touch the pendant at her throat. "Indeed. The household has become bloated with unnecessary expenses, and I intend to remedy that situation." His tone was businesslike, almost cold. "You will receive a month's wages and a character reference, which is more generous than many in your position might expect." Eleanor bit back the sharp retort that rose to her lips. She wanted to remind him that she had cared for his aunt with devotion, that she had worked long hours without complaint, that she deserved better than to be dismissed like a piece of unwanted furniture. But she knew such words would only make her situation worse. "I am grateful for your Grace's consideration," she said instead, though the words tasted bitter on her tongue. The Duke returned his attention to the papers, clearly expecting the interview to be concluded. But as Eleanor turned to leave, her movement caused the pendant to catch the morning light, sending a brief flash of silver across the room. The effect on the Duke was immediate and startling. He looked up sharply, his eyes fixing on the pendant with an intensity that made Eleanor's breath catch. The colour drained from his face as if he had seen an apparition, and his hands gripped the edge of the desk so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor's hand flew instinctively to the pendant, her fingers closing protectively around the familiar silver. "It was my mother's, Your Grace. A family heirloom." "Your mother's name," he demanded, rising from his chair with such sudden force that it scraped loudly against the floor. "What was your mother's maiden name?" The question was so unexpected, so urgent, that Eleanor found herself answering before she could think better of it. "Sinclair, Your Grace. Margaret Sinclair." The Duke's face went from pale to ashen, and he sank back into his chair, as if his legs could no longer support him. For a long moment, the only sound in the library was the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece and the distant patter of rain against the windows. "Impossible," he murmured, more to himself than to Eleanor. She promised." "Your Grace?" Eleanor ventured, alarmed by his obvious distress. "Are you quite well? Shall I summon someone?" The Duke seemed to collect himself with visible effort, though his eyes never left the pendant. "Tell me about your family, Miss Hartwell, your parents, your background. Leave nothing out." Eleanor hesitated, uncertain why her personal history should matter to a man who had just dismissed her from service. But something in his manner, a desperate urgency that seemed entirely at odds with his earlier coldness, compelled her to answer. "My father was Thomas Hartwell, a gentleman of modest means who owned a small estate in Yorkshire. My mother was Margaret Sinclair before her marriage. She came from Scotland originally, though she rarely spoke of her family there." Eleanor paused, remembering her mother's reluctance to discuss her past. "My father made some unfortunate investments and lost everything when I was 20. He died shortly after, and my mother and I were left with nothing but debts. We came here seeking employment, and your aunt was kind enough to take me into service." "And your mother? Where is she now?" "She lives in Rose Cottage on the estate, Your Grace. She's been ill for some time, a weakness of the lungs that grows worse each winter." Eleanor's voice softened with worry. "Without my wages, I fear—" But the Duke wasn't listening to her concerns about her mother's welfare. He had risen again and was pacing behind his desk like a caged animal, running his hands through his perfectly groomed hair until it stood in dishevelled peaks. "The pendant," he said suddenly, stopping his pacing to fix her with that intense stare. "Has your mother ever told you its history, its significance?" Eleanor shook her head slowly. "Only that it belonged to her grandmother, and her grandmother before that. She always said it would protect me, that someday I would understand its true value. But I assumed she meant sentimental value, nothing more." The Duke laughed, but it was a harsh sound, devoid of humour. "Sentimental value, yes, I suppose one might call it that." He moved to the window, staring out at the rain-soaked grounds. "Miss Hartwell, I must ask you to remain at Ashworth Manor for a few more days. There are matters that require clarification." "But, Your Grace, you've dismissed me. Surely it would be improper." "You will be compensated for the additional time, naturally." He turned back to face her, and Eleanor was struck by the change in his demeanour. The cold, calculating businessman had been replaced by someone who seemed almost vulnerable, uncertain. "I must speak with your mother. Today, if possible." Eleanor felt a chill of foreboding. Her mother was fragile, both physically and emotionally. The shock of Eleanor's dismissal would be difficult enough to bear, without the added stress of an unexpected visit from the Duke himself. "Your Grace, my mother is very ill. Perhaps if you could tell me what this is about." "No." The word was sharp, final. "This is a matter that concerns her directly. I will call upon her this afternoon, and you will accompany me to make the introduction." Eleanor wanted to protest, to demand an explanation for this sudden interest in her family, but the Duke's manner brooked no argument. She found herself nodding reluctantly, though every instinct warned her that this unexpected turn of events would bring nothing but trouble. "Very well, your grace, but I must ask that you be gentle with her. She's not strong enough for any great shocks or distress." The Duke's expression softened slightly, and for a moment Eleanor glimpsed something almost human in his aristocratic features. "I will be as gentle as circumstances allow, Miss Hartwell, but I'm afraid some shocks are unavoidable when the past refuses to stay buried." As Eleanor left the library, her mind reeled with questions and a growing sense of unease. What could her simple family pendant possibly mean to the Duke of Ashworth? Why had the mention of her mother's maiden name affected him so profoundly? And what secrets from the past was he so determined to uncover? The pendant seemed to burn against her skin as she made her way through the manor's corridors, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her quiet, predictable life was about to be turned completely upside down. Whatever connection existed between her family and the Duke, she sensed it would bring revelations that might prove more devastating than any dismissal from service. As she prepared for the afternoon's visit to her mother, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder if some secrets were better left buried, and whether the truth, when it finally emerged, would prove to be a blessing or a curse that would haunt them all. The carriage ride to Rose Cottage passed in tense silence, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of wheels against the muddy lane and the steady drumming of rain on the roof. Eleanor sat rigidly upright, acutely aware of the Duke's presence beside her in the confined space. He had said nothing since they departed the manor, his jaw set in a hard line as he stared out at the passing countryside with unseeing eyes. Rose Cottage appeared through the mist like something from a fairy tale, a small, thatched-roof dwelling with climbing roses that had long since shed their blooms for the season. Smoke curled from the chimney, and warm light glowed in the diamond-paned windows, creating an illusion of cozy domesticity that belied the poverty within. Eleanor's mother, Margaret, was waiting by the window when they arrived, her thin frame wrapped in a faded shawl. At 52, she retained traces of the beauty that had once caught Thomas Hartwell's eye, though illness had carved deep lines around her green eyes and left her auburn hair streaked with premature silver. When she saw the ducal carriage, her face paled with alarm. "Eleanor, my dear," she said, as they entered the modest sitting-room, her voice carrying the soft burr of her Scottish heritage. "What brings His Grace to our humble home?" The Duke removed his hat and stood awkwardly in the small space, his tall frame seeming to dwarf the simple furnishings. Eleanor watched as his eyes swept the room, taking in the worn but clean furniture, the carefully mended curtains, and the small portrait of her father on the mantelpiece. When his gaze finally settled on her mother, Eleanor saw something flicker across his features. Recognition, perhaps, or pain. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said formally, though his voice was gentler than Eleanor had expected. "I apologize for the intrusion. I am James Ashworth, Duke of Ashworth." Margaret's hand flew to her throat in a gesture that mirrored her daughter's earlier movement, and Eleanor noticed with surprise that her mother's fingers sought the same spot where a pendant might rest. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a curtsy despite her obvious weakness. "You honor our home with your presence." Please sit," the Duke said, gesturing toward the worn armchair by the fire. "I've come because I must ask you about something that may be difficult to discuss." Eleanor helped her mother to the chair, noting how the older woman's hands trembled as she settled herself. The Duke remained standing, his discomfort evident as he struggled to find the right words. "Mrs. Hartwell, Margaret, I must ask you about your family, your life before you married Thomas Hartwell." "Oi!" The effect of his words was immediate and startling. Margaret's face went white as parchment, and she gripped the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles stood out like ivory knobs. I don't understand, Your Grace. My past is of no consequence to anyone." "I'm afraid it is of great consequence," the Duke said quietly. He moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Margaret Sinclair, daughter of Hamish Sinclair of Glencoe, Sister to... Stop. The word came out as a strangled cry, and Margaret half rose from her chair before sinking back down. Please, Your Grace, that life is dead and buried. I'm Mrs. Thomas Hartwell now. Nothing more. Eleanor looked between them in growing confusion and alarm. Mother, what is he talking about? What does he know about your family? But Margaret seemed incapable of speech, her breathing coming in short, laboured gasps that made Eleanor fear for her health. The Duke, meanwhile, had gone to the window and was staring out at the rain with his hands clasped behind his back. Perhaps, he said without turning around, I should tell the story, since you seem unable to do so yourself. No, Margaret whispered. Please, I beg you. Eleanor doesn't need to know. It will only bring her pain. She has a right to know, the Duke said, finally turning to face them both, especially now, when that pendant around her neck marks her as... As what? Eleanor demanded, her patience finally snapping. Will someone please explain what is happening here? What does my mother's family have to do with you? And why does this pendant matter so much? The Duke looked at Margaret, who had closed her eyes as if in defeat. When she didn't speak, he sighed heavily and moved to stand before the fireplace. Your mother, Miss Hartwell, is not merely Margaret Sinclair of Glencoe. She is Lady Margaret Sinclair, daughter of the Earl of Glencairn, and... He paused, his voice growing thick with emotion. She is my mother. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Eleanor felt the world tilt around her, the familiar sitting room suddenly seeming foreign and strange. That's impossible, she whispered. My mother is... You're saying she's... Your grandmother, the Duke said quietly, which makes you my half-sister. Margaret's sob broke the stunned silence that followed. I never wanted you to know, she said through her tears. I never wanted either of you to know. It was better this way, safer. Eleanor sank onto the small sofa, her mind reeling. But how? Why? I don't understand any of this. The Duke sat down across from them, his aristocratic composure finally cracking to reveal the pain beneath. I was born James Sinclair, the illegitimate son of Margaret Sinclair and the Duke of Ashworth, the previous Duke, my father. When I was 3 years old, my mother disappeared from Ashworth Manor in the middle of the night, taking nothing but the clothes on her back and a silver pendant that had belonged to her grandmother. He looked directly at Eleanor. The pendant you wear now. Margaret wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. I was 17 when James was born, unmarried, disgraced, dependent on the Duke's charity. When his wife finally gave him a legitimate heir, James's older brother, I knew my position would become untenable. The new Duchess made it clear that my presence was no longer welcome. So you left, Eleanor said, beginning to understand. You left your son. I had no choice, Margaret's voice broke. I was given a choice, leave quietly with a small settlement or be thrown out with nothing. I hoped he would be better off without me. He would be raised as a gentleman, educated, given every advantage. What could I offer him? The Duke's laugh was bitter. What you could have offered me was a mother's love. Instead, I grew up believing you had abandoned me for money, that you cared nothing for the child you left behind. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as the full tragedy of the situation became clear. Her mother had sacrificed everything, her son, her family, her position, to give Eleanor's father a chance at happiness, never knowing that her first child would grow up believing himself unloved and unwanted. The pendant, Eleanor said suddenly. Why did you keep it? Why give it to me? Margaret touched her throat again, her eyes distant with memory. It was the only thing I had left of my family, of who I was before everything went wrong. I always hoped that someday, if James ever saw it, he would know that I never stopped loving him, that I never forgot. The Duke stood abruptly and moved to the window again, his shoulders rigid with emotion. I searched for you, he said quietly. After my father died, after I inherited the title, I hired investigators, followed every lead. But Margaret Sinclair had vanished completely, as if she had never existed. Because she became Margaret Hartwell, Eleanor said, understanding dawning. She took father's name and his protection and buried her past so completely that no one could find her. Until today, the Duke said, turning back to face them. Until I saw that pendant and realized that the woman I had dismissed from service was my own half-sister. The irony was almost too cruel to bear. Eleanor had been living on her brother's estate for 3 years, caring for his aunt, and neither of them had known of their connection. The pendant that was meant to protect her had instead led to her dismissal, only to reveal a truth that changed everything. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked, her voice small in the sudden quiet. The Duke looked at Margaret, then at Eleanor, his expression unreadable. "Now," he said slowly, "we must decide how to move forward. You are my family, both of you. That changes everything." Margaret shook her head weakly. "James, you don't understand. I gave up any claim to your life long ago. Eleanor and we're nothing to you now. We're just servants, dependents." "You are my mother," the Duke said firmly, "and Eleanor is my sister. That makes you both ladies of this house, whether you claim the title or not." Eleanor felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. The idea of being acknowledged as the Duke's sister was overwhelming, but it also meant leaving behind the only life she had ever known. "But the scandal," she said. "If people knew—" "Let them talk," the Duke said with a dismissive wave. "I've endured worse gossip than this. The question is, what do you want, both of you?" Margaret looked at her daughter with eyes full of love and regret. "I want Eleanor to have the life she deserves. The education, the opportunities, the chance to marry well and be happy. I want her to have everything I couldn't give her." Eleanor reached for her mother's hand, squeezing it gently. "And I want you to be well and safe, without worrying about money or the future." The Duke nodded slowly. "Then we are in agreement. You will both come to live at the manor as my family. Eleanor will be introduced to society as my ward. It will cause less scandal than the truth, at least initially. And Margaret," he paused, his voice softening, "Mother, you will have the best medical care available and a place of honor in my household." Or, as the afternoon light faded and the rain continued to fall, Eleanor felt as though she was standing at the threshold of an entirely new life. The pendant at her throat no longer felt like a simple family heirloom, but like a key that had unlocked a door to possibilities she had never dared to imagine. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that this revelation was only the beginning. What other secrets lay buried in her family's past? And what challenges would they face as they tried to build a relationship from the ashes of years of separation and misunderstanding? The future stretched before them, uncertain, but full of promise. And Eleanor found herself wondering what other surprises fate had in store for the newly reunited family of Ashworth Manor. 3 months had passed since the revelation that transformed Eleanor's world, and the change was nothing short of miraculous. Where once she had hurried through the servants' corridors with downcast eyes, she now walked the grand halls of Ashworth Manor as its acknowledged ward, her head held high and her bearing reflecting the education and refinement that James, she still struggled to think of him as her brother, had insisted upon. The transformation had not been without its challenges. Eleanor's days were now filled with lessons in deportment from Mrs. Pemberton, the stern but kindly governess James had hired, French conversation with Monsieur Dubois, and music instruction from the patient Miss Whitmore. Her wardrobe had been completely replaced with gowns befitting her new station, though she had insisted on keeping her mother's pendant, which now rested against silk rather than rough cotton. Margaret's health had improved dramatically under the care of London's finest physicians, and she had taken up residence in a beautiful suite overlooking the rose gardens. The reunion between mother and son had been tentative at first, marked by years of hurt and misunderstanding, but gradually they had begun to rebuild the bond that had been severed so long ago. This evening marked Eleanor's first major test as James's ward, the Ashworth Christmas Ball, an annual tradition that drew the finest families from across the county. Eleanor stood before her mirror in a gown of deep emerald silk that brought out the green in her eyes, her auburn hair arranged in an elegant chignon that showcased the silver pendant at her throat. "You look beautiful, my dear," Margaret said from the doorway, her own appearance transformed by proper nutrition and medical care. She wore a gown of midnight blue that complemented her still striking features, and for the first time in years she looked every inch the lady she had been born to be. "I'm terrified," Eleanor admitted, smoothing her gloves nervously. "What if someone recognizes me? What if they remember that I was once a servant in this very house?" "Then you will hold your head high and remember that you are Lady Eleanor Ashworth in all but name," Margaret said firmly. "You have as much right to be here as anyone." The ballroom was a vision of elegance, with hundreds of candles casting a warm glow over the assembled guests. Eleanor entered on James's arm, acutely aware of the curious glances and whispered conversations that followed their progress. James had prepared her for this, the speculation about his mysterious ward, the questions about her background, the inevitable gossip that surrounded any new addition to society. "Remember," he murmured as they paused at the top of the grand staircase, "you are Miss Eleanor Hartwell, daughter of a gentleman who was my father's dear friend. Your parents died tragically, leaving you in my care. It's close enough to the truth to be believable." Eleanor nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence. James had proven to be everything she could have hoped for in a brother, protective, generous, and surprisingly understanding of the difficulties she faced in adapting to her new life. The evening progressed smoothly at first. Eleanor was introduced to various members of the local gentry, and she found that her natural intelligence and the education she had received from her father served her well in conversation. She was discussing the latest novel by Sir Walter Scott with the elderly Lord Pembroke when a commotion near the entrance caught her attention. "Ah," Lord Pembroke said with obvious distaste, "it seems the Thornfield family has arrived. Late, as usual, and no doubt expecting to be the centre of attention." Eleanor followed his gaze to see a striking couple making their entrance with considerable fanfare. The man was tall and handsome in a cold, aristocratic way, with perfectly styled blonde hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to assess everything around him with calculating precision. Beside him walked a woman of extraordinary beauty, her golden hair arranged in elaborate curls, and her figure displayed to advantage in a gown of scarlet silk that was perhaps a shade too bold for a respectable gathering. "Lord Reginald Thornfield and his sister Lady Vivian," Lord Pembroke explained, with a sniff of disapproval. "Old family, considerable fortune, but rather too fond of their own importance, if you ask me. Young Thornfield has been angling for an advantageous marriage for years, though his reputation with the ladies is somewhat questionable." Eleanor watched as the Thornfield siblings made their way through the crowd, noting how conversations seemed to pause in their wake. There was something about them that commanded attention, though whether it was admiration or wariness she couldn't quite determine. Her contemplation was interrupted by James's appearance at her side. "Eleanor, I'd like you to meet someone," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that made her turn with interest. Beside him stood a gentleman of perhaps 30 years, with kind brown eyes and an easy smile that immediately put Eleanor at ease. He was not conventionally handsome, his features were too irregular, his build too lean, but there was something appealing about his intelligent face and the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. "Miss Hartwell," James said formally, "may I present Dr. Marcus Whitmore, recently returned from his studies in Edinburgh. Marcus, my ward, Miss Eleanor Hartwell." Dr. Whitmore bowed gracefully. "Miss Hartwell, it's a pleasure to meet you. I believe you've been taking music lessons from my sister." "Indeed I have," Eleanor replied, warming to his friendly manner. "Miss Whitmore is a wonderful teacher, though I fear I'm a rather hopeless student." "Nonsense," Dr. Whitmore said with a laugh. "Sarah tells me you have considerable natural talent. She's quite impressed with your progress." As they spoke, Eleanor found herself genuinely enjoying the conversation. Dr. Whitmore was well-travelled and well-read, with a passion for his medical work that was infectious. He treated her as an intellectual equal, asking her opinions on books and current events, rather than limiting their discussion to the weather and social pleasantries that seemed to dominate most ballroom conversations. "I understand you've recently returned from Scotland," Eleanor said. "I've always been fascinated by the Highlands. My mother has told me such wonderful stories about the landscape there." "It's a remarkable country," Dr. Whitmore agreed. "Wild and beautiful, but also harsh. The people there have a strength and resilience that I greatly admire. Perhaps someday you'll have the opportunity to see it for yourself." Their conversation was interrupted by a smooth, cultured voice. "Ashworth, you must introduce me to your charming ward." Eleanor turned to find Lord Reginald Thornfield approaching, his pale eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Up close, he was even more striking, but there was something cold about his perfection, like a beautiful statue carved from marble. "Thornfield," James said with barely concealed reluctance. "Miss Hartwell, may I present Lord Reginald Thornfield? Thornfield, my ward, Miss Eleanor Hartwell." Lord Thornfield took Eleanor's gloved hand and raised it to his lips, holding it a moment longer than propriety dictated. "Miss Hartwell, you are even lovelier than the rumours suggested. I confess myself quite enchanted." Eleanor felt a chill at his touch and gently withdrew her hand. "You're too kind, Lord Thornfield." "Not at all. Beauty such as yours deserves to be celebrated." His eyes lingered on the pendant at her throat, and Eleanor saw something flicker in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. "That's a lovely piece of jewellery. Quite unusual." "It was my mother's," Eleanor said simply, her hand moving instinctively to cover the pendant. "Indeed, how interesting." Lord Thornfield's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I have something of a passion for antique jewellery. Perhaps you would allow me to examine it more closely sometime?" "I'm afraid that wouldn't be appropriate," Dr. Whitmore interjected smoothly, moving slightly closer to Eleanor. "Family heirlooms are rather personal, don't you think?" Lord Thornfield's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, how thoughtless of me." He turned back to Eleanor with renewed charm. "Perhaps instead you would honour me with a dance. I'm told the next set is to be a waltz." Eleanor glanced at James, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Refusing would be rude, and she was here to establish herself in society, not to make enemies. "That would be lovely, thank you." As Lord Thornfield led her onto the dance floor, Eleanor was acutely aware of the watching eyes around them. He was an excellent dancer, she had to admit, guiding her through the steps with practiced ease. But his conversation was less appealing than his dancing. "You've caused quite a stir tonight, Miss Hartwell," he said as they moved through the waltz. "Everyone is curious about Ashworth's mysterious ward. Where exactly did you say you were from?" "I don't believe I did say," Eleanor replied carefully. "My family lived quietly in Yorkshire before my parents' death." "Ah, yes, the tragic accident. How fortunate that Ashworth was willing to take you in. Though I suppose he could hardly do otherwise, given his father's friendship with yours." "Bah!" There was something in his tone that suggested he knew more than he was letting on, and Eleanor felt a prickle of unease. "The Duke has been very kind." "Indeed, though one wonders what will become of you now. A young woman in your position must be thinking of marriage, surely. You'll need a husband who can provide for you appropriately, given that you have no fortune of your own." The comment stung, though Eleanor tried not to show it. "I'm quite content with my current situation, thank you." "Oh, for now, perhaps. But Ashworth won't want to support a dependent forever. A man in his position needs to think of his own future, his own family." Lord Thornfield's grip on her waist tightened slightly. "Fortunately, there are gentlemen who would be willing to overlook a lack of dowry in exchange for other qualities." Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with indignation. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Don't you? Come now, Miss Hartwell, you're an intelligent woman. Surely you understand that beauty and charm can be just as valuable as money in the right circumstances." The waltz ended, and Eleanor stepped back immediately, her heart pounding with anger and humiliation. "Thank you for the dance, Lord Thornfield. If you'll excuse me, I believe I need some air." She turned to leave, but his hand caught her arm. "Miss Hartwell, I hope I haven't offended you. Perhaps we could continue our conversation on the terrace." "The lady said she needed air, Thornfield. I'm sure she can find her way to the terrace without assistance." Dr. Whitmore appeared beside them, his usually gentle manner replaced by something harder. Lord Thornfield's eyes narrowed, but he released Eleanor's arm with exaggerated courtesy. "Of course. Another time, perhaps, Miss Hartwell." As he walked away, Eleanor felt a wave of gratitude toward Dr. Whitmore. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'm afraid I'm not very good at handling men like that. Men like Thornfield prey on young women who are new to society," Dr. Whitmore said grimly. "He's known for his persistent attentions to ladies he considers vulnerable. You were right to be wary of him." Eleanor looked across the ballroom to where Lord Thornfield was now speaking with his sister, both of them glancing in her direction with expressions that made her deeply uncomfortable. "I have the feeling this won't be the last I see of him. Unfortunately, you're probably right, but remember, you're not alone. Ashworth will protect you and—" He paused, his cheeks colouring slightly. "You have other friends as well, if you'll allow it." Eleanor smiled, feeling some of her tension ease. "I would like that very much, Dr. Whitmore. Thank you." As the evening continued, Eleanor found herself thinking about the contrast between the two men she had encountered. Lord Thornfield with his cold calculation and barely concealed predatory nature, and Dr. Whitmore, whose kindness and respect made her feel valued as a person rather than merely an object to be acquired. But she couldn't shake the feeling that her encounter with Lord Thornfield was more than just an unpleasant social interaction. There had been something in his interest in her pendant, in his probing questions about her background, that suggested he suspected more than he was letting on. As the ball drew to a close, and Eleanor prepared to retire, she couldn't help but wonder what challenges the coming weeks would bring. She had successfully navigated her first major social event, but she sensed that Lord Thornfield's attention was far from finished, and something told her that the pendant around her neck, the symbol of her family's hidden past, would continue to draw dangerous interest from those who might seek to use her secrets against her. The game of society was more complex and treacherous than she had imagined, and Eleanor realized that her real education was only just beginning. The weeks following the Christmas ball brought a flurry of social invitations and calling cards to Ashworth Manor. Eleanor found herself thrust into the whirlwind of Regency society. Morning calls, afternoon teas, musical evenings, and intimate dinner parties. With each event, she grew more confident in her role as the Duke's ward, though she remained acutely aware of the whispered speculation that followed her wherever she went. Dr. Marcus Whitmore had become a frequent visitor to the manor, ostensibly to check on Margaret's continued recovery, but Eleanor suspected his medical visits were merely an excuse to spend time in her company. She found herself looking forward to their conversations with an anticipation that both thrilled and alarmed her. He treated her as an intellectual equal, discussing everything from medical advances to political reform, and his genuine interest in her thoughts and opinions was a refreshing change from the superficial flattery she received from other gentlemen. Lord Reginald Thornfield, meanwhile, had proven as persistent as Dr. Whitmore had predicted. Hardly a day passed without some token of his attention: flowers, books of poetry, invitations to drive in Hyde Park. His pursuit was relentless and increasingly uncomfortable, made worse by the fact that James seemed to view him as a potentially suitable match. "Thornfield is well connected and wealthy," James had said during one of their morning conversations in his study. "His interest in you is quite marked, and such an alliance would secure your future admirably." Eleanor had bitten back her instinctive protest, knowing that James's concern for her welfare was genuine, even if his understanding of her feelings was lacking. How could she explain that Lord Thornfield's attention made her skin crawl, that there was something predatory in his pale eyes that spoke of possession rather than affection? The situation came to a head on a crisp February morning when Eleanor was taking her daily walk in the manor's gardens. The winter air was sharp and clean, and she had wrapped herself in a warm pelisse of deep blue wool, her breath forming small clouds in the cold. She was admiring the early snowdrops that had begun to push through the frozen earth when she heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. Miss Hartwell, what a delightful surprise! Eleanor's heart sank as she turned to see Lord Thornfield approaching, his tall frame elegant in a perfectly tailored greatcoat. He must have been admitted by the servants and directed to the gardens, though she couldn't imagine why he would call so early in the day. "Lord Thornfield," she said with forced politeness, "this is unexpected. I wasn't aware you had an appointment with the Duke." "I don't," he said with that cold smile that never reached his eyes. "I came to see you, actually. I was hoping we might have a private conversation." Eleanor felt a flutter of alarm. They were alone in the garden, far from the house, and something in his manner suggested this was no casual social call. "I'm afraid that wouldn't be proper, my lord. Perhaps you could call again when the Duke is available to receive you." "Oh, I think propriety is rather beside the point now, don't you?" Lord Thornfield moved closer, and Eleanor instinctively stepped back. "You see, Miss Hartwell, or should I say Miss Sinclair, I know exactly who you are." The blood drained from Eleanor's face. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Don't you? Come now, there's no need for pretense between us. I've done my research, you see. It's amazing what one can discover with the right connections and sufficient motivation." His eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. Margaret Sinclair, daughter of the Earl of Glencairn, who disappeared from Ashworth Manor 26 years ago after bearing the Duke's bastard son. And now here you are, her daughter, wearing the very pendant she took with her when she fled. Eleanor's hand flew to her throat, her fingers closing protectively around the silver pendant. "You're mistaken. My mother was Margaret Hartwell, wife of Thomas Hartwell of Yorkshire." "Was she indeed? How curious, then, that there's no record of a Thomas Hartwell owning property in Yorkshire. How strange that the parish records show no marriage between Thomas Hartwell and Margaret Sinclair." Lord Thornfield circled her slowly, like a predator stalking its prey. "Shall I tell you what I think happened? I think your mother created an entirely fictional husband to hide her shame. I think you are the illegitimate daughter of Margaret Sinclair and some unknown man, which makes you nothing more than a bastard's bastard." "That's not true," Eleanor whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. The story James had told her about their mother's marriage had always seemed somewhat vague, and she had never questioned it too closely. "Isn't it? Then why does Ashworth guard your background so carefully? Why the elaborate fiction about his father's friendship with yours? Why take such pains to establish you in society if you're truly his ward and nothing more?" Lord Thornfield stopped directly in front of her, his pale eyes boring into hers. "I think Ashworth knows exactly what you are, and he's trying to pass you off as respectable to avoid the scandal of acknowledging his bastard half-sister." Eleanor felt the world spinning around her. Could it be true? Was her entire understanding of her parentage built on lies? The thought that she might be illegitimate, that her mother's marriage might have been a fiction, filled her with a sick dread. "I can see you're beginning to understand," Lord Thornfield said with satisfaction. "But here's the truly delicious part. I don't care. Bastard or not, you're still beautiful, still useful to me. You see, Miss Sinclair, I have debts. Considerable debts that require immediate attention. Ashworth, however, has money. A great deal of money. I don't understand what this has to do with me. Don't you? It's quite simple, really. You're going to marry me, and Ashworth is going to provide a very generous dowry to ensure his dear ward makes a suitable match." He can hardly refuse, given that the alternative is having your true parentage exposed to all of society. Eleanor stared at him in horror. You're talking about blackmail. Such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as a mutually beneficial arrangement. You get a husband and a title, I get the money I need, and Ashworth gets to keep his family's secrets buried. Everyone wins. And if I refuse? Lord Thornfield's smile turned genuinely cruel. Then I'm afraid your reputation, and your mother's, will be destroyed. The scandal will be delicious. The Duke's bastard sister, living under false pretenses, deceiving all of society. You'll be ruined, of course, cast out without a penny. And your poor, fragile mother, well, I imagine the shock might be too much for her delicate constitution. The threat to her mother was what broke Eleanor's composure. Margaret had only just begun to recover her health and happiness. The revelation of her secrets, the public humiliation, the loss of her newfound security, it would destroy her. You're despicable, Eleanor said, her voice shaking with rage and fear. Perhaps, but I'm also practical. You have 3 days to consider my proposal, Miss Sinclair. I suggest you use them wisely. Lord Thornfield turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor standing alone among the snowdrops, her world crashing down around her. She sank onto a nearby bench, her legs no longer able to support her, and tried to think through the implications of what she had just learned. Was it true? Was her entire life built on a foundation of lies? And even if it wasn't, did it matter? Lord Thornfield clearly believed he had enough evidence to destroy her family, and the threat to her mother's health was very real. She was still sitting there, numb with shock and despair, when Dr. Whitmore found her an hour later. "Eleanor, good God, what's happened? You look as though you've seen a ghost." The sound of his voice, warm with concern, broke through her paralysis. She looked up to see him hurrying toward her, his medical bag in hand, his face creased with worry. "Marcus," she said, and then, to her horror, she began to cry. He was beside her in an instant, his arm around her shoulders, offering comfort without demanding explanations. For several minutes, she simply wept against his shoulder while he murmured soothing words and held her gently. "Can you tell me what's upset you so?" he asked finally, when her tears had subsided to quiet sniffles. Eleanor pulled back, acutely aware of how improper their position was, but unable to bring herself to care. "I can't. I wish I could, but I can't." "Has someone hurt you? Threatened you?" His voice hardened. "If Thornfield has done something, how did you know?" Eleanor asked, startled. "I saw him leaving as I arrived. His expression was rather too satisfied for my liking, and you're clearly distressed. It doesn't take a medical degree to connect those facts." Eleanor closed her eyes, wishing desperately that she could confide in him, but knowing that the truth would only put him in an impossible position. He made me an offer, one that I find distasteful, but may have no choice but to accept. "Marriage?" Dr. Whitmore's voice was carefully controlled, but Eleanor could hear the pain beneath it. "Yes. And you don't wish to marry him?" "I would rather die," Eleanor said with such vehemence that Dr. Whitmore drew back in surprise. "Then don't. It's as simple as that." "It's not simple at all. There are complications. Things you don't understand." Dr. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the winter garden. When he spoke again, his voice was soft but determined. "Eleanor, I know I have no right to ask this, and I know my circumstances are far from ideal, but would you consider an alternative?" "What do you mean?" He turned to face her, his brown eyes serious and intent. "Marry me instead." Eleanor's breath caught. "Marcus, you don't understand what you're saying. You don't know. I know that you're intelligent, kind, and beautiful. I know that I've come to care for you more than I ever thought possible. I know that my income as a physician is modest, but it's honest, and I could provide for you." He took her hands in his. "I know that whatever secrets you're hiding, whatever complications you're facing, I would rather face them with you than live without you. But your family, your position in society, will survive the scandal, whatever it is. Eleanor, I've seen enough of the world to know that happiness is rare and precious. If there's a chance for us to find it together, shouldn't we take it?" Eleanor stared at him, her heart pounding. Here was everything she had dreamed of, a man who loved her for herself, who offered partnership rather than possession, who would stand by her regardless of the consequences. But could she accept his offer knowing what it might cost him? "Lord Thornfield will be furious," she said finally. "He won't simply accept defeat. Let him be furious. What can he do? Challenge me to a duel, spread gossip. I've faced worse things than an angry aristocrat. You don't understand. He has information that could destroy my family. If I don't marry him, he'll use it." Dr. Whitmore was quiet for a moment, considering. "Then we'll have to make sure he can't use it, or that it doesn't matter if he does." "How?" "By getting ahead of the story, by controlling the narrative ourselves." He squeezed her hands gently. "Eleanor, whatever your secrets are, they can't be worse than living a lie for the rest of your life. Trust me. Trust us." Eleanor looked into his earnest face and felt something shift inside her. For weeks, she'd been living in fear of discovery, of scandal, of losing the security she had found at Ashworth Manor. But perhaps security built on lies wasn't worth having. Perhaps the risk of truth was better than the certainty of a loveless marriage to a man who saw her only as a means to an end. "Yes," she said quietly. "Yes, I'll marry you." Dr. Whitmore's face lit up with joy, and he lifted her hands to his lips, pressing gentle kisses to her gloved fingers. "You've made me the happiest man in England." "We'll need to speak to James immediately," Eleanor said, her mind already racing ahead to the challenges they would face. "And we'll need to be prepared for Lord Thornfield's reaction. He won't give up easily." "Then we'll face it together," Dr. Whitmore said firmly. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." As they walked back toward the manor, Eleanor felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. The future was uncertain, and she knew that difficult times lay ahead. But for the first time since Lord Thornfield had revealed his knowledge of her secrets, she felt hope. She had chosen her own path, and whatever the consequences, she would face them with a man who loved her enough to stand by her side. The pendant at her throat seemed to warm against her skin, as if her mother's promise of protection was finally being fulfilled, not through hiding from the truth, but through finding the courage to embrace it. The real test would come when they faced James with their decision, and when Lord Thornfield learned that his carefully laid plans had been thwarted. But Eleanor was no longer the frightened girl who had been dismissed from service all those months ago. She was a woman who had found her strength, her voice, and her heart's desire, and she was ready to fight for all three. 6 months had passed since Eleanor's wedding to Dr. Marcus Whitmore, and the small market town of Millbrook in the Cotswolds had become more of a home to her than any grand estate ever could. The modest stone cottage that served as both their residence and Marcus's medical practice sat at the edge of the village green, its windows overlooking rolling hills dotted with sheep and ancient oak trees that had weathered centuries of English seasons. Eleanor stood in her small but well-appointed kitchen, preparing tea for the afternoon patients who would soon arrive. The morning light streamed through diamond-paned windows, illuminating the herbs she had been drying, chamomile, lavender, and feverfew that she had learned to cultivate under Marcus's patient tutelage. Her hands, once soft from a life of privilege, now bore the honest calluses of a woman who worked alongside her husband, assisting with his medical practice and tending to the needs of their community. The transformation in her life had been nothing short of remarkable. Where once she had worried about the proper way to address a duchess or which fork to use at a formal dinner, she now concerned herself with more meaningful matters, helping Marcus deliver Mrs. Patterson's 7th child, teaching the village children to read in the small schoolroom they had established in their parlour, and organising relief efforts for families struggling through a particularly harsh winter. The silver pendant still rested at her throat, but it no longer felt like a burden of secrets. Instead, it had become a symbol of the journey that had brought her to this place of contentment. Marcus knew the full truth of her parentage now. She had told him everything on their wedding night, and his response had been to hold her close and whisper that her past only made him love her more for the courage it had taken to overcome it. The confrontation with Lord Thornfield had been every bit as ugly as Eleanor had anticipated. When James had announced her engagement to Dr. Whitmore at a hastily arranged dinner party, Lord Thornfield's mask of civilized charm had slipped entirely. He had raged about breach of promise, about social climbing physicians who didn't know their place, and had threatened to expose Eleanor's illegitimate birth to all of society. James's response had been swift and decisive. With the calm authority that came from generations of aristocratic breeding, he had informed Lord Thornfield that any attempt to spread malicious gossip about his family would result in immediate social and financial ruin. The Duke of Ashworth's influence, it seemed, extended far beyond the boundaries of his estate, and Lord Thornfield's creditors were suddenly very interested in collecting their debts. The scandal that Lord Thornfield had threatened to create never materialized. Instead, Eleanor's marriage to the respected Dr. Whitmore was celebrated as a romantic love match between a duke's ward and a gentleman physician. Society, always eager for a good story, embraced the narrative of the beautiful young woman who had chosen love over fortune. Margaret had been overjoyed by the match, though her health had prevented her from making the journey to Millbrook for the wedding. She remained at Ashworth Manor, where James had installed her in a position of honor as his acknowledged mother. The reunion between mother and son had healed old wounds, and Margaret's letters to Eleanor were filled with contentment and pride in both her children. Eleanor was arranging wildflowers in a simple pottery vase when she heard the familiar sound of Marcus's footsteps on the front path. He had been out since dawn, attending to old Mr. Henley's gout and checking on the new baby at the vicarage. She smiled as she heard him speaking to someone outside. His voice carried the warm authority that had made him beloved throughout the district. "Mrs. Whitmore," came a voice from the doorway, and Eleanor turned to see Marcus entering with a young woman she didn't recognize. The girl couldn't have been more than 16, with tangled brown hair and clothes that spoke of poverty and hard living. Her eyes were wide with fear and exhaustion. "This is Sarah Mills," Marcus explained gently. "She's walked 15 miles from the next village seeking help. Sarah, this is my wife. You can trust her completely." Eleanor immediately set aside her flowers and moved toward the girl, her heart going out to the obvious distress in the young face. "Sarah, you look exhausted. Please, sit down and let me get you something to eat." "Dean," as Eleanor bustled about preparing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and warm milk, Marcus examined the girl with his characteristic thoroughness and compassion. Sarah's story emerged slowly. She was the daughter of a tenant farmer who had fallen behind on his rent. The landlord, a man of cruel disposition, had demanded payment in a form that no decent father could accept. Sarah had fled in the night, hoping to find work in service somewhere far from her village. "I heard tell that Dr. Whitmore was a good man," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that he and his wife helped folks who had nowhere else to turn." Eleanor felt her heart clench with sympathy. How many young women found themselves in similar circumstances, with no protection and no recourse against men who would exploit their vulnerability? She looked at Marcus and saw her own thoughts reflected in his compassionate brown eyes. "You're safe here," Eleanor said firmly, taking the girl's trembling hands in her own. "We'll find a solution that doesn't require you to sacrifice your virtue or your dignity." Over the following days, Eleanor and Marcus worked together to help Sarah establish herself in Millbrook. They found her a position with Mrs. Hartwell, the baker's widow, who needed assistance with her shop and was known for her kindness to young women in difficult circumstances. Eleanor also began teaching Sarah to read and write, skills that would give her more options for her future. The incident with Sarah sparked something in Eleanor that had been growing since her arrival in Millbrook. She began to see how many women in their community faced similar challenges: poverty, lack of education, vulnerability to exploitation by men with power over them. With Marcus's encouragement, she started what she called the Ladies' Improvement Society, a weekly gathering where women could learn practical skills, share resources, and support one another. The society met in the Whitmore's parlour every Thursday afternoon, and it quickly became one of the most popular events in the village. Eleanor taught reading and writing to those who needed it, while other women shared skills like preserving food, managing household budgets, and basic medical care. Most importantly, it provided a space where women could speak freely about their concerns and challenges without fear of judgment. One particularly memorable Thursday, Eleanor was teaching a group of young mothers about the importance of proper nutrition for their children when an unexpected visitor arrived. The sound of an expensive carriage on the village street was unusual enough to draw everyone to the windows, and Eleanor's heart skipped when she recognized the Ashworth coat of arms. James stepped down from the carriage with his usual elegant grace, but Eleanor was surprised to see that he wasn't alone. A young woman emerged after him, petite and dark-haired, with an air of quiet confidence that immediately caught Eleanor's attention. "Eleanor!" James called out as he approached the cottage, his face bright with genuine pleasure. "I hope you don't mind the unexpected visit. I've brought someone I'm very eager for you to meet." Eleanor hurried out to greet them, conscious of her simple day dress and practical apron, but James embraced her warmly without any regard for such considerations. "You look wonderful," he said sincerely. "Country life clearly agrees with you." "It does indeed," Eleanor replied, then turned expectantly to his companion. "Eleanor, may I present Miss Catherine Pemberton?" James said, and Eleanor was amused to see a faint flush colour his cheeks. "Catherine, my sister Eleanor." Eleanor's eyes widened with delight as she realized the significance of James's obvious attachment to the young woman. Miss Pemberton was the daughter of a respected but not wealthy clergyman, exactly the sort of match that would have been considered beneath the Duke of Ashworth's notice in the past. But James had clearly learned something from Eleanor's own experience about the value of choosing love over social expectation. "Miss Pemberton," Eleanor said warmly, "what a pleasure to meet you. Please, both of you come in. I'm afraid you've caught us in the middle of our weekly ladies' meeting, but I'm sure everyone would be delighted to meet you." The afternoon that followed was one of the most enjoyable Eleanor could remember. James and Catherine were genuinely interested in the work she was doing with the village women, asking thoughtful questions and offering practical suggestions. Catherine, it turned out, had been involved in similar charitable work in her father's parish, and she and Eleanor quickly discovered a shared passion for education and women's welfare. As the other ladies gradually departed, Eleanor found herself alone with James and Catherine in her small sitting room. Marcus had been called away to attend to a difficult birth, but he had promised to return in time for dinner. "I have news," James said, his expression growing serious. "About Thornfield." Eleanor felt a familiar chill at the mention of that name. "What about him?" "He's dead," James said simply. "Killed in a duel 3 weeks ago. It seems he had been spreading lies about the wrong man's wife, and her brother called him out. Thornfield was never much of a shot, apparently." Eleanor was surprised by her own reaction to the news. She felt no joy in Lord Thornfield's death, only a kind of sad relief that his capacity for causing harm had finally come to an end. "I can't say I'm sorry," she said honestly. "He was a man who seemed to take pleasure in others' pain." "Indeed, but his death does resolve any lingering concerns about his threats against our family. You're truly free now, Eleanor. Free to live your life without looking over your shoulder." Eleanor smiled, touching the pendant at her throat. "I've been free for months, James. The moment I chose to marry Marcus and leave that world behind, I found a freedom I never knew existed." Catherine leaned forward with interest. "You gave up a life of privilege to marry for love. How wonderfully romantic." "It was the best decision I ever made," Eleanor said without hesitation. "I learned that security built on lies and fear isn't really security at all. True safety comes from being loved for who you really are, not for who others want you to be." James nodded thoughtfully. "You've taught me a great deal about courage, sister. Your example gave me the strength to follow my own heart." He reached for Catherine's hand, and Eleanor saw the love that passed between them. "Catherine has agreed to be my wife, despite the difference in our stations." Eleanor clapped her hands together in delight. "Oh, how wonderful! Catherine, you'll make a perfect duchess. And James, you've chosen wisely. Love is worth far more than any social advantage." As the evening progressed and Marcus returned home, Eleanor reflected on how much her life had changed since that day when she had been dismissed from service at Ashworth Manor. The pendant that had once seemed like a burden of family secrets had become a symbol of the strength that ran through generations of women in her family, the strength to endure, to adapt, and ultimately to thrive. She looked around her modest sitting room, filled with the people she loved most in the world, and felt a contentment that no grand ballroom or elegant drawing room had ever provided. She had found her place in the world, not through birth or marriage to a title, but through the work of her hands and the love in her heart. The silver pendant caught the firelight as she moved to serve tea, and Eleanor smiled, thinking of her mother's words about protection and purpose. Margaret had been right. The pendant had protected her, not through magic or mystical power, but by leading her to the truth about herself and her family. And in finding that truth, Eleanor had discovered something far more valuable than any inheritance or social position. She had found herself, and in doing so, she had found her home. As the evening drew to a close and James and Catherine prepared to return to Ashworth Manor, Eleanor stood in her doorway, watching their carriage disappear into the gathering dusk. Marcus's arm came around her waist, and she leaned into his warmth, feeling perfectly content with the life they had built together. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, as he often did. Eleanor touched the pendant one more time, then shook her head. "None at all. This is exactly where I'm meant to be." Durst, the stars were beginning to appear in the clear country sky, and Eleanor thought about all the women who would come after her, the daughters and granddaughters who would inherit not just the silver pendant, but the legacy of courage and determination it represented. They would face their own challenges, make their own choices, and find their own paths to happiness. But they would do so knowing that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from fighting against your circumstances, but from having the wisdom to bloom wherever you find yourself planted. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you discover that the place where you've taken root is exactly where you were meant to be all along. Thank you for joining Eleanor on her journey from servant to Duchess's ward to country doctor's wife. If you enjoyed this story of love, courage, and finding your true place in the world, please like this video, subscribe for more historical romance tales, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Until next time, remember that your worth isn't determined by your circumstances, but by the choices you make and the love you give.